Before we begin, I need to do a little bit of housekeeping.
This is why I haven't been able to make a video since last June.
Welcome to the CSB Media Arts Center in Farmington, Connecticut. This has basically been what I've been up to for the past 6 or 7 months. I've spent the entirety of the time since my last video preparing to and attending the Connecticut School of Broadcasting so I can try to further my career. There are plenty of great people here, and I've met some interesting faces. Some of you might know that I went live back in December for the first time. That was for one of my final projects. By the time this video is being recorded, I'll have fully finished this school, and I'll be on my way to getting a job in an industry I wanted to be involved in for pretty much my entire life. Entertainment and broadcasting. I mean, it's called the Connecticut School of Broadcasting for a reason, people.
So if you're wondering why the studio I'm in looks so professional, now you know why.
Now that we've got that out of the way. So, 2022. Honestly, I feel like this year was better than previous for me. There were some negative moments, don't get me wrong, but I feel like there were more positive things going on than negative. Of course, when it came to Death Battle, 2022 was a year of changes and experimentation. The Death Battle server I've mentioned before became the official one, and while I'm admittedly not happy with the changes they've made, they also allowed for more cool things for their fans to do, including more ways to interact with the team. As for the quality of the season, well, remember how I said back during Season 7 that I wasn't sure how I felt about the season as a whole? Season 9 was kind of like that too, except larger. The quality felt inconsistent throughout, really. You'll see what I mean when we get through the rankings.
Now then, I think I've delayed this long enough. This is Wolf's Top 17 Season 9 Death Battle episodes. Wait a second. There are no bad episodes this season.
Surprised? Yeah, me too. I didn't think any episodes were bad this season. Now, mediocre, on the other hand.
Don't cry, Sponge. Let's be super friends.
I can already tell some of you are going to complain about this in the comments or in the live chat about how this episode is actually really good or how this is a joke episode, so I shouldn't be treating it so seriously. And let me just say this. I get that it's a joke episode. It's not like I hate joke episodes. Remember back in Season 2, Chuck Norris vs. Sika Sanshiro and Hercule Satan vs. Dan Hibiki were both in the top 5. That's not my problem with this episode. For me, the jokes just didn't land home all that often. Now that being said, this is a far better joke episode than Macho Man vs. Kool-Aid Man. For one, they didn't hype the hell out of this one, so my expectations were at least lower than before. On top of that, a lot of the writing is decent? I actually know some people that despise this episode for how much it relies on the joke of SpongeBob is so broken that he's practically a god, and the whole Aquaman is useless narrative. While I can't say I completely disagree, there were more jokes than that, and when they utilized those other jokes, the episode was fantastic. Need I remind you of this face? Honestly, this one actually made me like the episode even more than I probably would have. I also think that this episode is more of a way to get rid of the Aquaman that people do think is useless, especially now that we have an Aquaman that people love with Jason Momoa. And that's where everything stops being consistently good and starts being okay at best. I'm not too keen on the voice acting from SpongeBob. Granted, anyone outside of Tom Kenny who tries to voice SpongeBob has an uphill battle, so I can't fault Tom Schalk for not matching up. Kirsten Howard's pretty good as Aquaman, at least, but that wasn't very difficult to do. Ocean Men is also a song that's great as a backing track, but not so great on its own. Honestly, I should probably come up with a name for that kind of song, given how frequent it is. And while there were good jokes here and there, most of them were not all that great. I don't know. I thought this episode wasn't all that special like everyone else thinks, but at least it's not a bad episode, thankfully.
On my honor as a gentleman, I will protect her with my life.
Wow, only at number 16 and we found the most meh episode of this season. That's kind of the way I feel about most everything in this episode. A shame because I like Jonathan as a character. I've only watched part 1 of JoJo, but compared to everything I've seen about the other JoJo protagonists, he's honestly my favorite. Let's get some of the things I did like about this episode out of the way. I love Breathless Blades. It's not one of my top favorites of the season, but it is a banger of a song. I think most of the writing during the battle was pretty good too, especially that tearjerker of an ending. And most of Benji Buckley's voice acting for Jonathan is great. Most. Everything else is kinda bland. Besides his first and final lines, I didn't care much for Zach Maher's voice for Tanjiro. And while I praised Benji for most of Jonathan's voice acting, I didn't care for when he started shouting. Everything else was just average, really. Nothing else I can say about this one.
So I know Death Battle was trying some different stuff this time around, but this episode still leaves me scratching my head.
I'll admit that I'm not really a Dragon Ball fan, so I was extremely confused by the idea of this matchup being done as a death battle, and also lacked any interest in it anyway. Even some people who I knew were Dragon Ball fans didn't seem all that interested. It feels like maybe this should have been the bonus episode of the season, because everything about the way it was done seemed to be more for that than of a finale. Whether it was the reason why they're fighting, or the way they talk about the fight in the analysis. I did like the animation. It was really well put together, though it feels weird hearing Goku's voice in Death Battle and not having it be Masako X. I'm not saying that Michael Kovac did a bad job, it's just weird. I know some people complained about there being too many borrowed shots and choreography that looks too similar, but all I can say is that Death Battle has done that before, including with really beloved episodes, so I don't see why it's an issue here. My big problem is more with the writing, which, besides during the fight itself, feels a lot drier than other episodes. But there is one thing that I think saves this episode: Dragon Dance. Hot damn, this song kicks ass. Though it weirdly feels like it has a similar issue to American Phantom, where it's better as a solo track than a backing track. If it weren't for that, I might have placed this episode somehow even lower.
I think people are really starting to become burnt out on Marvel vs. DC matchups, and with episodes like this one, I don't blame them.
I never offered you a choice. Now, everything you've built will fall.
To be fair, Black Adam vs. Apocalypse tried to do something interesting. I liked the comic panel intro at the start, and I liked the cool mix of 3D backgrounds and sprite artwork, even if it's rather deceptive of what type of style the episode's going for. And having a villain win over an anti-hero or hero character is something so rare that I don't really remember if they've ever done it in Death Battle before. The voice acting is pretty decent on both characters too, especially the vocal effects for Apocalypse, although it also makes it really hard to understand him sometimes. Also, while I know people don't really like when Death Battle has rap songs in their episodes, I don't mind it, especially Fallen Gods. It's not as awesome of a backing rap battle song as What's Up Danger, but it's still pretty good, especially when they actually have Brendan singing. But then you've got issues like the writing being honestly very dull. It's not as bad as Gogeta vs. Vegeto's, but there weren't really any funny moments in the analysis this time. Also, while I did praise them having the outright villain win, it feels kinda messed up that it's happening while Kahndaq is being outright destroyed by Apocalypse. It leaves a bad taste in your mouth because of it. Also, having the camera literally crack when Apocalypse stomps on Black Adam's face leaves me with several questions that have me extremely confused. The only other thing I can comment on is that the death is brutal and I kinda dig it. It makes sense for a villain like Apocalypse to be that brutal. So yeah, an alright episode, but at least there are some good moments.
Okay, so I was told by Star that when I make this video, that I should make this joke when it comes to this episode.
Been decapitated recently? All right.
I know a lot of people were really disappointed by this episode. Trust me, I kinda was as well. But it's not an episode I dislike. Heck, this one just needed a couple of things to be considered good. First, I know that people didn't like that this fight was 3D and thought this should have been live action, but my guess is that they didn't have room in the budget for a live action fight this season, as much as I know people were disappointed by it. Plus, some people were still getting over a freaking pandemic in 2022, so understandable. Still, the 3D animation was mostly solid. My only problem with it was that it was really short. Although, really, there wasn't much going on in the animation for the episode anyway, so maybe the fact that this fight was this short was a blessing in disguise. Seriously, the only thing anyone seemed to really like in the animation was Lightning Slim Sam over here, who quickly became a meme over on the subreddit, especially with his running animation. But the analysis portion was actually really damn good. The characters talking about both Jason and Michael the way they were, as well as the episode premise itself being the makings of a horror film, are a nice touch. Also, TGIH is a good song for what it is. It has to be a good backing track while not being all that interesting to listen to on its own, because that's how most horror movie songs are outside of main themes. I don't know, I feel like this episode gets a little too much hate, but it's nothing all that special.
I know 2 sections ago I said that people were starting to become burnt out by Marvel vs. DC matchups, but I don't know, this one was pretty fun.
And for my final trick, swish it roll once. No more witches. Ladies and germs.
This episode was one I think a lot of people were anticipating since WandaVision ended, and I'd say it was worth it. The voice work from Cassandra Vladislavo as Wanda was great, giving her an accent that we don't usually get from most other performers for her. And Lauren Mayfield did a killer performance as Zatanna, pun not intended. I also love the way this fight scales up in intensity between the two. It is a little short, which is disappointing, but it's still great to watch. I also really like the hand-drawn elements in this as well, since they really are stylish. On the other hand, the sprites left a lot to be desired, really. I think the big problem is how up close they are with them, even compared to others. Given the letterbox formatting, your eyes are drawn to them as well. Also, while Zatanna does win this fight, the way they explain it is easy to take the wrong way. Trust me, I already know. Spellaholics Synonymous is also a song I like, but not all that much. It's a little better as a backing track, but it's still pretty good on its own, and it heavily references A Strange Fate from back during Season 5. It's a good episode, but not a great one. And speaking of...
Number 11. Just like the last bonus episode that I had to rank.
Excellent work, Tenno. Now for the Foundry. Oh, it's finished.
This was a little more interesting for a bonus episode for me than what the 7 Battle Royale was, though it feels weird to see the actual sponsored character winning, despite the fact that he did so anyway. I do like the animation quality on this one, although at certain points it felt a little too slow. Mornell and Caitlyn both did great work with their voice work,
sounding especially close to the actual voices for Raiden and the Lotus, respectively.
The Metal Lotus is alright. Like, it's not bad, but I've heard better original songs before as well. That's kind of the thing with this episode. It didn't do anything bad, but there are elements to it that are just kind of underwhelming. Still, for a bonus episode, they put plenty of work into it to make both combatants look good. Heck, they even gave a reasonably good example of one thing Raiden does better than Excalibur. It was pretty close to being a great episode, but it just wasn't quite able to hit the mark.
As we go into the top 10, I want to remind everybody watching this video that my opinions are my own and they're not going to match up with everybody else's. There are people on YouTube with more subs than me that have different opinions, and I respect those people, but we're going to disagree, and this episode is no exception.
I'll be taking this. Fools.
This episode is honestly the most fun way I could have seen them having the Predator be brought into Death Battle. While Predator's analysis is rather screwy, it's not anything like Goku Black's analysis last season, where the explanation is completely screwed up. Also, Nemesis Bloodreich pointed out that they never explained the countdown or the fact that Dutch escaped by sprinting, but upon rewatch, they mentioned that the Predator activates a countdown to the nuclear, can't say that word on YouTube, blast, and they even showed Dutch running away from the explosion before he escapes. Still, that doesn't mean there aren't problems. For one, the fact that Cameron didn't try to sound like a Kiwi is noticeable thanks to recent work Boba's been in. Granted, I think they were going more for original release Boba and not digital remaster onward Boba, but it's still a weird thing to hear. If It Bleeds also is very much like TGIH, where it's better as a backing track than it is to listen to on its own, but that's to be expected. There's also weird continuity questions, like how did Boba get into the tree to drop a thermal detonator in Pred's face when he had one arm and the jetpack was disabled? Or why did the Predator get confused by the fire the first time when he knew where Boba was? They're issues that don't drag you out of the immersion initially, but they're issues you see when you do think about them. But it's pure fun, so it's understandable if you ignore these things. Still, it does hurt the episode enough to keep it just in the great category.
You know, it's funny. I think this might have been the best season premiere since seasons 2 and 3.
Wait! Don't you want to get in close and savor my emotions as you deliver the final kill? Nah. Bye.
I was super excited for this episode when it was announced, and it actually lived up to my expectations. The episode was great in almost every regard. I love the animation the most in this episode. Harley and Jinx looked like they were incredibly fun to animate with all the crazy things they do. The way they move feels both realistic and cartoony at the same time, if that makes sense somehow. I also love the writing for both, which it seems like was even more fun because of how crazy they are. But that craziness was also not taken too far and seemed out of control for either of them. I also love Mad Laugh Riot, which feels like a song that matches perfectly with being an awesome action track on its own, and an amazing backing track that feels like it was written by both ladies. The performance by Futakuchi Mana really is one of the best vocal performances for a death battle track. My only real issue is that Felicia Valenti and Elsie Lovelock's voices for Harley and Jinx respectively take some getting used to. Still, it's an episode that really drove the viewers crazy with excitement.
As a reminder for everybody, before I make these lists, I actually do initial thoughts as each episode comes out, and then, as I'm making the script for a video, I actually rewatch entire seasons and order it that way. In the initial thought process, this episode was actually near the bottom.
Bond, come in. What's the mission status?
Smashing. Positively smashing.
Oh, do grow up, 007.
I'll admit I wasn't too fond of this episode's idea alone. Like many others, I was hoping for James Bond versus Jason Bourne, though I never really considered who to actually have John Wick fight, unlike how everyone else thought he should fight Agent 47. But while I still think the connections are rather flimsy, the episode itself is still very well put together. The action of these two is great, as it absolutely should be. The two look a little weird, but they blend surprisingly well together. The writing is pretty good too, although I still wonder why Wick didn't try to get out of the way of the chandelier coming down. I'm honestly not fond of Secret Service, even as a backing track. It sounds like a lot of noise. However, the highlight of this episode was the voice acting. Stephen Kelly did a really good job voicing Bond, and Murnau sounds almost perfect as a voice double for Keanu Reeves. Hell, Liam did a great job as Q. The voice acting really dragged this episode as high up as it did. Still surprised that it managed to sneak its way up this high, but I suppose one episode had to crash the party in this part of the list.
Conversely, while Bond vs. Wick was actually the third worst in initial thoughts, this episode was actually the third best.
I did it! Take that, Detroit.
Even though this episode dropped in the ranking from its original feeling, which I'm surprised was initially listed as high as it was, considering I had to watch it on a tablet instead of my computer, since I was actually celebrating my friend's birthday when the episode came out and was out of town. Regardless, even though all of that happened, the animation from these two was really good, and the sprites might have been the best looking ones of the season. And they are animated really well. Each hit had a lot of impact to them, even if the kill didn't really make a lot of sense given how Asta's swords work. But then again, I think I get how it worked. I also think the voice acting from both was great, even though I would have loved it if Anthony Del Rio had voiced Deku, just like how Justin Briner had voiced Hit. Still, Jose Estrada did a really good job as Deku, and Michael Kovac was great as Asta. And while I'm not too keen on it as much as Mighty, I still like Strongest Alive. The song is incredibly fun as a result. However, this episode is only at number 7 because, and get ready to mark your bingo cards on this, I just like the rest of the fights on this list even more. I know I say that with a lot of these, but it's true every time. Still, this episode is great, so don't count it out as one of the season's best.
So we've had episodes where one of the combatants is from a specific form of media. Why not have an episode where both of them are?
I told you. It's no. Yes.
I think doing the fight this way was probably the best way to do this. Trunks, just from the anime alone, fully obliterates game-exclusive Silver, while these two versions are a lot closer in power and theme as well. The fight animation itself was a lot of fun, and it was actually easy to understand what was going on, unlike the last time Archie Comics was involved in Death Battle. Not to mention, it showed just the insane amount of things they can do, especially Trunks. Although his transformation into Super Saiyan God oddly makes him look like Silver from Pokemon, which I'm sure was purely a coincidence. While I'm not as fond of it as other people, Hedge of Tomorrow is a banger of a song. The song feels incredibly intense at the right times to make the fight flow really well, while also keeping things slow to build up the tension as well. As expected, Kaiser Neko did a great job voicing Trunks, as expected for his abridged actor. And Esu Onsti was great as Silver. Whoever he is, someone should hire him to voice some big roles outside of Death Battle because I'm sure he'd do a killer job. Honestly, I love this episode, but unfortunately, the next 5 just did that one little extra thing to go above and beyond. You could try and convince me this episode deserves to be better, but you'd only be wasting your time. Simply put, it's no use.
This season was full of surprises, wasn't it? I mean, to end the year, we had 2 characters from the same franchise that people had been arguing for years about who would win in a fight. And then before that, we had an episode where both combatants were actually taken from outside of their main canon material. And before that, we had an episode where both characters came from a form of media that Death Battle had never used before. Mythology.
The Monkey King emerged victorious!
Wow, would you look at that? I struck him so hard he was reduced to nothingness.
With a formidable foe slain, stricken against the mountain's breast, so ends our great tale of East and West.
As someone who loves mythology, and has since he was a kid, this episode really got me excited, even if I was confused about what they were doing with it at first too. Death Battle has always said before that they didn't want to do a fight between characters who didn't have any visuals to measure, but using the actual myths as the basis for their feats thankfully turned out well, and the fight itself was just as fun as I was hoping it would be. Where do I even start? Well, let's talk about the music first. A Hero's Journey, while not all that great, was still beautifully put together and fits the epic feeling these two bring to the episode. Speaking of bringing things to this episode, the voice acting. Blythe Mellon did a great job making Heracles sound like a legendary hero, just as his myth made him out to be. And Alex Mai's voice for Sun Wukong really fit for the devious little hyper-murder monkey. The writing is great as well, and while Monkey's section did rely a little bit too much on the "this is just like anime" joke, it doesn't really get that annoying. I also love the narration in this, and Christian Young did a great job with it. I'll admit, the part about the godly forms of Heracles and Monkey fighting was confusing to some, but I actually got the idea pretty well. But above all, I think my favorite part about this fight was the visuals. Deku and Asta might have had the best sprites of the season, but this episode had the best visuals overall. Heck, the sprites even look like they flow perfectly, to the point that sometimes you forget it's a sprite fight. My only real complaint is that it can be hard to understand what's happening at times. Like how Sun escaped from Heracles' Hydra arrows after getting shot by them, or what the perspective is on the fight since it changes a couple times. Also, I'm worried about the can of worms this might have opened when it comes to using mythological figures. Gods help us.
Tanjiro vs. Jonathan may have tried to tug at your heartstrings at the end of the fight, but this episode practically tried to yank them out before the fight was even over.
You are welcome.
Honestly, this fight was just a visual spectacle with so many things happening. While I still think Hercules vs. Sun Wukong looks beautiful, this one looks intense. With how much that was going on, it reminds me a lot of Madara vs. Aizen from last year. That intense, action-filled fight that has a lot going on, and it makes you tired from watching it, really showing off just how much these two are capable of. The voice acting was also spot on for this. Joshua Waters did a great job as Tetsuo, seeming to lean more into the Joshua Seth voice for him, but also mixing in some of Jan Rabson's voice as well. But for me, Edward Bosco was the one stealing the show here. He really improved on his voice for Magneto from DBX, this time doing an extremely good job sounding like Tom Kane's voice. I love it when Death Battle decides to bring back a voice actor that initially didn't do a very good job, only for them to knock their role out of the park, like what happened with Kira Buckland. Ego Death is also a rush of a song, and it really encapsulates the gloomy atmosphere of the fight and of just Akira itself. And the writing? Absolutely top-notch. This is honestly the first time I've ever seen Death Battle do a mercy killing, and wow, does it get to you! There's only one thing I don't like about this episode, and that's the hand-drawn bit of Tetsuo trying to strangle Magneto. It's just not a very good look, especially compared to the other hand-drawn parts of the fight. Still, this fight was absolutely hectic and I loved it. A mind-blowing experience through and through.
I have to wait a few more years for Arthas versus Cecil to even have a chance now. At least this fight was worth it.
There is no life in the void. Only death.
This was a fight that managed to somehow make the slower pace work. It knows how to make these two seem like big, lumbering demigods whose main asset is how durable they are. The attacks are slow but strong, and yet the fight only lasts as long as it needs to. Each attack feels like it has an impact, and like it's actually trying to accomplish something, even if it doesn't really work. The writing is amazing, and I've seen people quote this fight repeatedly, especially Arthas' response to Soren threatening to tear out his heart. Plus, they've managed to take two of the most convoluted, long narratives in all of media and somehow condense them down enough that anyone who has never actually sunk themselves into either story could actually properly understand these characters. One King to Rule Them All is a glorious and epic song, and I think this is the first time a Death Battle song has used an actual choir in one of their original tracks, which fits amazingly. I also love Philip Sacramento's voice for the Lich King. It really gives him that booming, threatening voice that the King of the Undead deserves. However, that does lead me to my only gripe with this episode. Ryan Solis as Sauron. It feels off. I don't know what attempt he was going for with Sauron, but making him sound like Dr. Claw from Inspector Gadget was not the direction I would have gone. Oh well, at least this episode is a fun experience. Now if only Activision Blizzard could make playing WoW a fun experience too.
Is it just me, or have the hand-drawn fights been getting better with every season?
Remember what I promised you. Now swallow. Merry Christmas.
Whoo boy, this fight was certainly brutal and I loved it. This episode feels like the polar opposite of Sauron vs. Lich King, whereas that fight was slow and methodical, perfectly matching the lumbering tankiness of both Sauron and Arthas. This fight was fast and did exactly what it needed to, which is how these two seem to like doing their murders. Have I sold you on the violence level of this fight yet? Because yeah, it is violent and brutal. When I was rewatching this for the list, I was watching it in a server with friends, and my friend James practically screamed bloody murder when he saw Homelander's nose get broken by Nolan. And that's especially helped out by the animation for this fight. Whoever animated this better have been paid handsomely for seeming to mix the art style of both Invincible and The Boys Diabolical perfectly, to the point you'd think that this was animated by the people over at Prime TV themselves. I swear, it's fantastic. Also, the writing for this is great too. The reasoning for these two to fight each other is perfectly in character, while they manage to avoid spoiling things from the comics too much for people who are only interested in these two because of the Amazon Prime shows. The audio, though, is where this episode really excels. I hate the fact that the fight ends so early when Diabolical Invincible Me is such a banger of a track. Seriously, this song kicks ass and really does get across how violent these two are. And the voice acting? Top notch. Tom Schalk really does a great job getting across a voice that sounds like J.K. Simmons' voice for Nolan without sounding too similar to him. And goddamn, Yang Ye did a great job voicing John. This man can get across everything that makes Homelander such a dick. The cocky attitude, fake positivity, and that threatening aura of, this man will kill you and enjoy every 6 seconds of it. I love this episode, and it's got so many good things going for it, but, well, only one could top it.
Some seasons it's hard to pick a number one. Sometimes I have 2 or 3 or even 4 episodes that stay near the top, and I have to try and figure out which one is better than which. That happened with Season 6 and Season 7. Then there are times where an episode does so great upon initial release that it grabs the number one spot and never lets go.
Always aim for the head.
I will be one of the first people to admit that I wasn't too keen on this fight at the beginning. I figured people were tired of seeing superheroes in death battle, even seeing them get brought back all the time, and Vegeta had so many other possible opponents to give him. I figured it'd be a slog to sit through, and that there wasn't much that was going to make Vegeta come even close to winning this, so it would have been super obvious who'd win, and that we would have gotten a retread of Hulk vs. Broly. I'm happy to say that I was wrong on all fronts, saving knowing who would win the fight. This fight is absolutely amazing. It's not going to surpass Carnage vs. Lucy or Link vs. Cloud 2021 as my all-time favorite, but it's high up there, and I don't know what problems people would have with this episode. Hell, the closest you could get to complaints is that Vegeta and Thor's heights aren't matched up properly at all, or saying that Thor being 10 times stronger than Vegeta was labeled as close, when lesser characters have had far smaller differences in strength or speed, and basically had that difference treated as a blowout. But the latter, even they made it seem like there's a reason to believe Vegeta's strength could possibly close the gap. But let's talk about the actual good things in this episode. I love this animation so much. This is another fight that gets so immersive and fun, you forget you're watching sprites fight. Even if Vegeta and Thor are a little too close in height, you forget about it, because it's just so much fun watching these two duke it out. The fact that they took an open environment and made it work without having to make it go to somewhere like space or another dimension is an impressive way to keep the fight relatively contained and show creativity with restraint. Each hit feels like it has an impact, and when it doesn't have an impact, that's usually because it's not meant to. Every particle and lighting effect is beautifully well made. It's great. I have some nitpicks here and there that make the fight animation a little bit confusing, but again, it's easy to completely ignore those things because of the fun. The voice acting's pretty spot on too. Jonas Scott once again does a great job as Thor, and finally gets his first win as a voice actor, and he's complemented almost perfectly by Lanny once again reprising his role as Vegeta, who I have to imagine just loves doing the voice, considering that he's done so in like 5 different death battle related videos, if my counting is correct. And that shouting of Final Flash is honestly a highlight of the season for me. But without a doubt, my favorite thing about this fight is probably Princess of Pride, which has completely surpassed Lost Ice Storms for a new favorite original song for pretty much the exact same reasons Lost Ice Storms replaced Wings of Iron. It made me want to constantly go back and rewatch the episode over and over again. I know that this fight has been getting a lot of love in the community, and I don't know how popular it is to say this, but I honestly think it deserves the title of Best Episode of Season 9.
Once again, I'd like to apologize for not having made a video since last June, but now that my classes are over, as at the time of recording this, I'll be able to get back to working on more of them. I've got a couple projects lined up that I think you guys will like, including a surprise or two that I think you'll want to stay tuned for. Hope you all have a happy 2023, and here's hoping that Season 10 is going to be a good one. And given the 2 episodes that won the poll, we're off to a good head start with the fight ideas already.